We've arrived at the penultimate session and last panel discussion in a long and richly rewarding day. So I'll keep it short on the grounds that no one ever faulted a panel moderator for his brevity. Besides, some of you were kind enough to listen to quite a long lecture I gave last night. I'm also aware of the overriding imperative of Koyo's line of flight to Shannon Airport. In her introduction to the EVA catalogue, Koyo reminds us that architecture is an essential colonial tool that is used to impose power and inspire awe. And the subject of this session, as Woodrow mentioned, is architecture and memory. In Ireland, as elsewhere, the built environment is a vivid index of the sedimentations of history, including those bound up with colonialism and its aftermath. Being a very biddable moderator, I'll try and respond to Koyo's, very briefly, to Koyo's hope that this would be a more joyful and perhaps less traumatic session. Let me just say, and this may be painful, that Larry's invocation of that genre of racist joke that was once popular in these islands, featuring an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Welshman, which usually ended up with the Irishman being lampooned for being ignorant and uncouth. Of course, the worm sometimes turns, and if we're talking about architecture and construction, the only version of that kind of joke I can currently recall involves a foreman on a building site in North London interviewing prospective employees, and he asks the Irishman, the Englishman, and the Welshman to explain the difference between a joist and a girder, and the Englishman and the Welshman fails, so he says, "Paddy, can you tell me the difference between a joist and a girder?" And he says, "Of course, that's easy. Joyce wrote Ulysses and Goethe wrote Faust." Anyway, sorry, that's a really old one. So this afternoon, offering us some insight on the subject of architecture and memory are Dr. Aislinn O'Donnell, a lecturer, soon to be professor, in the philosophy of education, and historian John Logan, both of whom have close ties to Limerick, so we're getting back to the local, to some extent at least, in this closing session. After their presentations, as I think you know by now, we'll be joined on stage for the panel discussion by Professor Luke Gibbons, who will then close the symposium's proceedings with his own closing remarks. So I'll invite John onto the stage to kick us off.
Koyo, you asked us to look at the Barbarians again, and specifically about architecture and memory. And you reminded us that it is an essential tool of colonial experience, colonial times, colonial places, colonized places. And in our particular place here, Limerick, one of the earliest representations, it's somewhat fanciful, doesn't, I suppose, approximate the ways we would want to represent, but it is one of the earliest representations of the city, and you'll see it's divided into, clearly. You have the English town, the larger, and the Irish town. And this is replicated everywhere else in Ireland. The towns, possibly when the Scandinavians came and established cities, as they did Limerick, you may have had Danish town and Irish town, or perhaps some other names, but the names that persisted, and indeed persist to today, is English town and Irish town, the original city. Very small, you could walk across it from, including the Irish and the English, you could do it in 10 minutes. The This is better in terms of its representational skills. It's probably our first accurate in the sense of relating to specific points on a map, measurable distances and so on, representation of the cities. Many of those buildings are still here. The castle and the cathedral dominating the English town, and that little umbilical bridge, Ball's Bridge, joining over to the Irish town, which doesn't get much representation in the sense it's literally and metaphorically off the map. It's the place, of course, in where those who service the needs of the others live. One couldn't survive without the other, and that relationship is there from, as I said, probably the 8th or 9th century and well into the early modern, indeed into the modern period. Things change quite dramatically, I think, in the middle of the 18th century, just at that moment when empire is taking off, the great imperial project of Britain. And Ireland, of course, was intrinsically part of that. And one of those makers of empires, a man called Edward Sexton Perry, who owned the land we are now standing on. He owned, in fact, all of the land of what has become the modern city centre. And Perry established, in his own mind, the notion of Newtown Perry. See it there, the grid, and of course we can see the grid anywhere where empire went at this time. We can still see the Irish town, we can see the English town, but in a sense they're being left behind. This great speculative project is underway by the 1760s. And just to focus us a little bit, his ideal, essentially a Renaissance Baroque type city, a ceremonial space, wasn't fully realized. Some of his open spaces weren't, his ornamental open spaces weren't fully realized, or in fact not realized in some cases. But essentially, those of us who live in Newtown Perry can find our block, can find our place. And for the convenience of now, of today, I've just put at the bottom there, we have an X. That's roughly where we are now. If you look down the axis, the grand axis of what is now O'Connell Street, it was then Georgia Street, the King's Street. If you look down there, you'll see that I've boxed one of the buildings. And that was to be the fulcrum of, I suppose, the shift from the medieval to the modern, from the feudal to the capitalistic, from the local to perhaps the global. And that key building, that key point, was the new Custom House. The Custom House, of course, is, as we know, through the empire, the Custom House is more important even than the cathedral, more important than the castle or the garrison. It's the centre of government power. It's the centre of tax collection. And the modern state can't survive without an effective Custom House. And Perry got one of the go-to architects of the day, a man called Davis Duckhart, an Italian, to come and do the Custom House for him. It was very much an anchor trophy type building. He was, if I can borrow a contemporary term, he was a star architect at the time. He also, of course, helped Perry in the design of the new town as well. Those Baroque open spaces are Duckhart's. The Landis, Perry, the architect, and the speculator owner come together and create something quite extraordinary in the context of what had been there before. So the Custom House got built, and we used it for the last couple of months for your exhibition, or part of it, a small part of it. And it continues to be used. It's now, as you know, it's a museum. But this was, as I said, the centre of civic power, of civic commercial power at the time. All goods coming in or out of Limerick literally went through those arches, or at least the inventories went through the arches of that building. The Collector of Customs lived in the building as well. And the Collector of Customs, cousin of Perry's, his name was George Monsell, and he lived there. He reared his children there, and he died there. And his brother, meantime, was head of the public administration of the public service at the other side of the world, in that other part of empire that was beginning to expand. He was governor of Madras, Chennai, in South India. And on this smaller part of this detail of the previous map of Madras, Chennai, you see there are two things that we notice immediately. One is the fort on the bottom left-hand corner, and that's where Monsell, the head of the administration, lived. I hope to get a picture of his residence to compare it with his brother's residence in the Limerick Custom House. But that was his headquarters. And of course, just down, it's literally 5 minutes walk away, is Blacktown, Irish town. A place where those who served those who ruled, lived. It's still there. If you go as a tourist to Chennai, you'll be told to make sure you take a walk through Blacktown. And Blacktown has its interpretive centres, its model tenement house, to see how the natives lived. Analogous in some ways to our Frank McCourt Muse tenement and museum here. When Monsell came back from India, he bought an estate here in the city. It's now the seat, it's now the site for Limerick's University. The building you're looking at is 1860s. It's simply an extension. Eventually, every Irish property owner builds the extension if he doesn't actually knock down the old house and replace it with something much grander. So this is Plassey House. For the first 30 years, the university wasn't quite sure what to call it. They inherited the name Plassey House. They weren't quite sure. It had something to do with India. But the founding president, in fact, preferred that the house would, through the migration of student language and shorthand, it stopped being known for a while as Plassey House and became known as the White House. So presidential vanity and helped to slide away the completely misunderstood sense of what Plassey actually meant. What it meant, of course, Plassey was the great victory for the British over the North India people. It was accompanied by massive exploitation, pillage, robbery, and rape. The commander at the battle, Lord Clive of Plassey, came home to England, the richest man in England. And one of his Irish lieutenants, Thomas Monsell, came home and bought himself a country seat. What happened in Ireland after independence, that extraordinary discussion we've just sat through, listened to, talked about the uselessness in some senses of the term post-colonial. Colonial continues. One man who was perhaps aware of that was John Keating. Keating was a Limerick man. He was born 100 yards from here. And he became a distinguished and very influential president of the Royal Hibernian Academy. He was a traditionalist. He set his back firmly, decisively, and immovably against modernism and the modern movement, and he ruled the Academy in that way. He was also an Irish nationalist, Republican, socialist, and in 1924 he painted an allegory. And the two diggers are digging the grave for the Republic. There are opposing sides. They can't agree on what the Republic should actually be. They fought their wars, the War of Independence, and then they fought amongst themselves about the nature of the legacy and how it might be experienced and exploited. So they are digging in different directions, and they're not speaking, they're avoiding each other. Keating himself is sitting there, utterly worn out, it seems, by the trauma of the whole thing, with his wife and his young child. And of course, what Keating wants us to look at is church and state, the priest who has lived successfully and comfortably through one regime and is about to continue on through the next, having a chat, as we do in Ireland, with the boss, the Perry, the owner, the speculator, the developer. And in the background, of course, the mansion, the Palladian mansion, could have been designed by Ducart around the time he did the Custom House, is burnt out. And the question there, simply in architectural terms for the new state, is what architecture will we have? Where will we go? Will we rebuild? And if we do, what will we build? In Limerick, the citizens turned their minds to an improving institution. And with the money from another great speculator, Andrew Carnegie, a Scotsman, they got the money to build a new library for the city. And that's the site. It was in Limerick's most exclusive, socially exclusive and prestigious location at the time, Perry Square. So what would be built? And the competition was organised by the Institute of Architects in Ireland, and as happens today, the professional body that represents architecture in Ireland. The first prize winner was his drawing. The thing, the proposal that merited first prize in the minds of the architects has been lost. We don't know what it looked like. But around the same time he was building this in O'Connell Street, Dublin, the large, overgrown headquarters of the Dublin Baking Company. It became one of the casualties of the Rising just 100 years ago. So that was first prize, and it was ruled out because it was considered that his proposal would have been too expensive. The second prize was this, and this drawing has survived by the English architect Voysey. Something approaching, or at least setting some of the foundations of modernism. And it was ruled out by the local committee as being unsympathetic to national aims and national sentiment. Was it because he was an Englishman, or was it simply because it didn't look right? Was it an aesthetical decision, or was it a political decision? And this was the winner, and this is what we got. George Sheridan's Hiberno-Romanesque imagined national architecture. And that, of course, is partly why it's here now, why we're looking at it. It's because it is, of course, the headquarters, and has been for the last 40 years, practically, of EVA. So English town, Irish town, black town, white town, modern Limerick. And it's a technical map. It's based on the smallest administrative decisions, but it effectively covers the city area. Irish town is no more in a sense. It's not even a post address. English town is hardly referred to any more than Newtown Perry is. But we know this as the city. We don't know it in the sense that we may not have actually visited every part of it. We know that there is another part that is different from the part we live in ourselves. This is a map that shows relative affluence and relative deprivation. And you can see there, the planner in the City Hall described to me yesterday as that funnel, she said. When you look at the map, you'll see the funnel. It narrows at the centre, an hourglass perhaps. And the darkest and the brownest is the poorest. And the bluest is the richest. So the degree of segregation, and this map could be, this is just Limerick because this is where we are today, this map could be drawn with similar results. You'd see similar patterning for a map of Galway, for a map of Cork, for a map of Dublin, and so on. I pointed us, and you, Koyo, pointed us in the direction of architecture. I'm not going to go into an aesthetic discussion or look at the question of what do people get and what is the shape, the size, the style of the places we live in. But suffice to say, I think that when you look at an Irish suburb, or this is Tala in West County Dublin, it could be on the edge of any large Irish town. And when you look at what's there, when you get down to street level, whether it's that of the people who are almost classes in the sense that they have no economic function, they're outside of the market. And as you move up through that, up through the de-skilled manual workers, the less skilled, the more skilled, into the groups and categories of workers who are working in the new technological and chemical industries and so on. What one prominent architectural critic, Shane O'Toole, recently referred to as failure on a gigantic scale. People live in houses, houses that haven't been designed, that haven't had that infusion of architectural spirit. We can do brilliant architecture in Ireland. We do magnificent buildings. Our architects are known through the world to make the monumental, the grand, and the expensive. But back home, relatively little of our lives is affected by a direct architectural input. Failure could be apportioned, but I do think, if I may make a personal comment, that architects themselves, perhaps there aren't enough of them, architects themselves perhaps need to interact with ordinary people, the people who live in places like Tala, and see what can be done. But there's a huge issue in relation to the market and the economics and so on, which is certainly would be another day's work. Moving towards a conclusion, and looking back at our city, at Irish Town, a bit blurred, the images here. Here's a photograph from the air. From the air, and it's the English town, looking from the cathedral, St. Mary's, up towards the bridge and the castle. about 1990. And through that, what remains of the English town at that time, we can point out, you can just about see terraces of houses where people lived. Perhaps inheriting houses, perhaps certainly living in the space, in the place where their families had lived for the previous centuries, right back. The castle itself, here, is inhabited. There are about 25 housing units in it. Just up from the cathedral, you can see terraces of houses going down towards the river. And we're seeing this, the photograph captures it just at a moment before what became and what continues to be known as urban renewal and urban development starts. This is about 10 years later, and that process is well underway. The castle has been emptied of people. People had lived in that castle for 900 years. It's been emptied, some of those terraces are gone. The council has built its headquarters on the site of a former jail. The terraces that we notice have become the council's car park. So, where did the people go? They went to those suburbs. They were removed, they were displaced, and the site, the place, the English town became available, was wanted for an essential part or a key part of an emerging major industrial sector, tourism. Tourism stroke heritage. So you had a castle or the remains of a castle, and then you wanted to recreate and build around and add to. This is the moment at which history disappears. It disappears with the disappearance of those memories that are removed from the city, put out into the suburbs, out into the fields, out into places that don't have names, and certainly don't, for the people who are moving and living there, don't have a history. So you build things like this. You imagine, you fabricate a history. This is on the site of 3 or 4 houses where families grew up and lived, and some of the children who grew up in those houses are still alive and they're living a few miles away. Occasionally go in, bring in their grandchildren to have a look around. They don't really recognise it. It's a very, very different place. Somewhere down underneath the foundations of that, their history is buried. So we fabricate our histories. We have Camelot in Bedford Row. And I suppose the question I wanted to leave us with is, what can be done? Obviously education. Everybody says education. So we've got education, we've got media and so on. But I'd just like us to return to an earlier point, and that is to the museum. It seems to me that when the city built this, its proper title, Carnegie Free Library and Museum, the idea was that it was going to be a place where a museum, whatever that would be, the museum itself was shifting from being the cabinet of curiosities. This type of thing. That's a photograph taken in the museum. And that's the type of, it was one room on the top of the library where schoolboys and old men came in to look at coins and tusks, African tusks and skins of tigers pinned on the walls. They're mostly gone because in the years since that photograph was taken, the city neglected its museum. I've just listed there, I sat with the curator yesterday and he said, right, let's draw up a list of all the places we've been since 1976, over the last 40 years. 8 different sites. They're hardly unpacked in one and they're asked to move to the other. It just seems to me that the city might just manage to create a laboratory for its history, an archive where citizens could go if it turns its attention to the museum.